Okay, so let's have a look at topic 3.2 on interest rates. Before we get onto this though, let's just have a quick review of topic 3.1. So we're not interested in these markets, not yet. We will a little bit later when we start to understand the banking system a little bit more and monetary policy, but we're focusing more on debt markets at the moment. So we have lenders and borrowers lending money directly. The lenders lend money directly to the borrower. There's no intermediary. And these markets are called debt markets. This topic 3, is focusing on short-term debt markets, whereas topic 4 is focusing on long-term debt markets. Now, all of these debt markets that we're talking about can be represented in this form using the demand and supply of loanable funds, a competitive market, which gives us an equilibrium interest rate, in this case of 5%. Now, the demand of loanable funds, that comes from these borrowers. And the supply of loanable funds, that comes from these lenders. So it's the interaction of the lenders stepping forward with their money and the borrowers stepping forward with a need to borrow money in these markets, which determine the equilibrium interest rate, and ultimately at the equilibrium, how much money is traded in each of these markets. When I say traded, I mean borrowed, loaned. Okay, so the demand and supply of loanable funds. Now, with this interest rate of 5%, it's important to understand that this is an annual equivalent interest rate, or an annualized interest rate. So let's just imagine we're talking about short-term debt markets now, and let's just assume that this market for money, this market for loanable funds, is a 90-day market. So if you want to lend money for 90 days in Australia, you can go into this market. If you want to borrow money for 90 days in Australia, you can go into this market. And of course, the money traded in this particular market must be Australian dollars. So the Germans are going to have equivalent markets and they'll transact in euros. The Americans, equivalent markets, they'll transact in US dollars. We're dealing with Australia here, so obviously Aussie dollars. Now, we're assuming, I haven't got it written anywhere, but we're assuming that this is now the 90-day market for money. There's going to be people wanting to lend for 90 days, borrowers wanting to borrow for 90 days. Now, this interest rate of 5%, it's important to understand that this interest rate is not the interest rate that you will get paid if you lend money in this market for 90 days. Imagine that. Because if you could, as a lender, if you could get 5% for 90 days, what you could do is lend your money once for 90 days and earn 5% on your money, then lend it again for 90 days. Once the first 90 days are up, lend it again for 90 days, earn another 5%, and just keep doing it that way. So obviously there's roughly 4 lots of 90 days in a year, and ignoring the compounding of the returns, you'd be looking at an annual interest rate of 20%, which is ridiculous. That interest rate is way too high. So this is an annualized interest rate. So I won't worry too much about the numbers being perfect to give me this 5%, but it's roughly going to work this way. This 90-day market for money, the actual interest rate paid for 90 days might be 1%. But this 5% is the annualized equivalent of that 1% interest rate. So what that means is, if you go into this market and lend money for 90 days, you might get paid a 1% return on your money as a lender over that 90-day period. And then you could go into that market again and lend it for another 90 days and get another 1%. Then you could go in the third quarter of the year, lend that money again for 90 days and earn another 1%. So we're up to 3%. And then the final quarter of the year, you could lend it again earn another 1% on your money for 90 days, that's 4%. Now let's imagine that when you lend your money and you get paid that 1%, you re-lend not only the original principal, but also the interest you got paid in the previous period. So if you had $1,000 to lend in this market, it's more likely $1 million, but anyway, we'll work with manageable numbers. If you had $1,000 to lend in this market, and for 90 days, this market offered you 1%, at the end of that 90 days, you would have $1,010. So then in the next 90 days, you lend $1,010 and get a 1% return on that. So what you're doing is you're compounding your money. You're kind of reinvesting, in a sense, re-lending not only the original amount of money that you had, but also the interest that was paid in the previous period. So what I'm kind of saying, the numbers don't quite work out, but let's just imagine that this 1% was paid and that you took this 1% was paid for the first 90 days. Then the second 90 days, you re-loaned $1,000 plus the 10%, the $10 interest in the second period. And then in the second period, you earn interest of 1% on $1,010. Then you took all of that money, including the interest, and re-loaned it in the third period. You would be getting interest on interest. You'd be compounding your returns in effect. And let's just imagine if you did that, then over the course of the full year, you earned 5%. So if you didn't compound your money and loan out the interest, you would just get a straight 4%. But let's just imagine the compounding gives you an additional 1%, which makes up the 5%. Now, those numbers I've used don't quite work out, but I'm keeping it deliberately simple. So this 5% in this 90-day market for money is an annualized interest rate. So it's not the 5% is not the interest rate you'll actually get for 90 days, but it's the equivalent annualized rate. Now, if this is still a little bit confused, hopefully it's not, hopefully most of you have got it. But if it's still a little bit confusing, just look up something, do a little bit of research on something called the annualized interest rate. And you'll learn about how interest rates are converted to annual equivalents when you're talking about periods of borrowing and lending of, say, less than a year. If we were talking about a 2-year interest rate, it would be a little bit different, quite different, because I could then say, well, if this is the 2-year market for money now, and the loan has a duration of 2 years, then 5%, the 5% interest rate would be the annual interest rate that is paid. So I would get 5% in year 1, 5% in year 2. So that's quite straightforward, but it's when you're considering lending of less than a year where it gets a little bit tricky. So we will be seeing interest rates in 90-day debt markets, 180-day debt markets, 1-day debt markets. And all of these interest rates, it's important to realize all of these interest rates that we'll be showing you data for, they are all annual equivalent interest rates. As I said, I'll be showing you an interest rate for 1 day, a 1-day interest rate very soon. And that interest rate might be 5%. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you get paid 5% on your money for 1 day. That would be an annual return of over 1,800%. It's ridiculous. So hopefully that makes sense. Coming down here, next slide of this topic. So we've only got two slides in this particular video. Number 3, we go on to discount securities. We'll get to that later. But in this one, what I've got is sort of a timeline of the duration of lending. So in what I've got here is short-term debt markets and long-term debt markets. So if we go back to this slide, debt markets are split into short-term and long-term. What I mean by that is in this graph. Short-term debt markets are anywhere from 1 day up to 1 year. Long-term debt markets, lending occurs from 1 year up to 30 years and beyond. Now, long-term debt markets, this is the next topic. These debt markets in topic 4 that we'll be discussing, long-term debt markets, very complicated. So it's best that we leave that till topic 4 so we can do it properly. But we're dealing with these short-term debt markets here. So anywhere from lending and borrowing anywhere from 1 day to say 1 year. Where you separate short and long-term debt markets is a little bit arbitrary, but we're going to say it occurs at 1 year. Okay, the next thing to appreciate is that whether we're talking about the market for money or loanable funds for 1 day, or 30 days, or 90 days, or 180 days, or even 1 year, all of these different markets for money can be represented this way. In each one of these markets, there will be a demand for money and a supply of money. And they can be represented that way. Demand and supply curve determining an equilibrium interest rate. Now this is going to be, this could sound a little bit strange, a little bit hard for you to visualize, because for many of you, it'll be the first time that you have been introduced to these markets, but they are there. And I will provide some case studies later on in this topic, which help you sort of visualize what these markets are all about. Now, the 1 day market is a very special market, and we'll be devoting an entire video to that market, because of this 1 day market for money is where the Reserve Bank intervenes in this market and implements monetary policy through that market. It's called the overnight cash market. And the interest rate in this particular market is called the cash rate. Now, all of these markets are called money markets. Whereas if you're talking about longer term borrowing, they're typically called bond markets. So let's focus on money markets. Now, each of these markets will have what we call a debt instrument to facilitate the borrowing and lending in these markets. So just imagine that we've got 2 big organisations in the 90-day market for loanable funds, and we've got a lender and a borrower, and they've established an agreement. The interest rate might be 5%, and the term of the loan, well, we know that it's 90 days. What they need is a debt instrument to facilitate that transaction. And the debt instrument sort of lays out the terms and the conditions of the loan. Now, the terms and the conditions will be much more detailed than simply the duration of the loan of 90 days and the annualized interest rate of 5%. It will be much more complex than that. But just for now, we're more interested in the names of the debt instruments themselves. Okay, right here, 3 of them. Treasury notes, bank bills, and commercial paper. Treasury notes for the government, bank bills for banks, commercial paper for other companies. These are all what we call discount securities, and I'll explain exactly what a discount security is in the next video. We don't have to worry about that for now. But we do need to come to terms with what these discount securities actually represent. You know, what are they? Well, what is a treasury note? What's a bank bill? That sort of thing. Okay, so let's focus on bank bills. Let's just imagine that you bank with the ANZ. The ANZ is constantly borrowing money in all of these markets, both short-term and long-term debt. I hinted previously that banks obtain a lot of their money to lend to customers from the deposits of other customers. That's true. But banks also borrow money in these short-term debt markets and in long-term debt markets to lend to their customers as well. So let's just imagine tomorrow you go into the ANZ Bank and you negotiate a $1 million mortgage. The question then becomes, where is that $1 million going to come from? Some of it will come from savings accounts and the term deposits of other customers at the ANZ. Some of that money will be borrowed by the ANZ in these short-term debt markets, and the rest of the money will be borrowed by the ANZ in these long-term debt markets. I'll show you exactly how that works later on. Not in this lecture, a little bit further down the track in the course. So what we're going to do now is focus on these short-term debt markets. Let's just imagine you go in to the ANZ and you undertake a loan to buy a house for $1 million. Now the bank's going to get that money from long-term debt markets, short-term debt markets, and some customer deposits as well. But let's just focus on the portion of your loan, your mortgage loan, that is financed through these short-term debt markets. And let's just imagine, and I'm keeping the numbers very simple, unrealistically small, these numbers, but I'm just keeping it nice and simple to just aid in the clarity of the explanation that I'm trying to give to you. So $1 million mortgage, and the bank, let's just imagine the bank needs to borrow $200,000 of that $1 million that they'll give to you to buy a house, $200,000 through the 90-day loanable funds market or the 90-day debt markets. To actually borrow that money, your bank will have to go into that market. It's all done electronically, but they'll enter that market through their computer systems and issue or offer a bank bill for sale. And that bank bill is the debt instrument. It's the financial instrument that the bank uses to facilitate the borrowing of that $200,000, which they then lend on to you. So a bank bill is nothing more than a debt instrument. It is a type of discount security, which will become clear soon, but it's just simply a financial instrument that the bank uses to borrow money in these short-term debt markets. So think of it this way. Imagine that the ANZ Bank is borrowing $200,000 to lend to you in the 90-day market, but they are borrowing that $200,000 from a Japanese superannuation fund located in Tokyo. Now, of course, the Japanese would need to take their yen and exchange it for Australian dollars before they can then lend it to the ANZ, but we'll let the Japanese superannuation fund take care of that. So the transaction would look like this. The Japanese superannuation fund would hand over 200,000 Australian dollars to the ANZ Bank. And the ANZ Bank in return would give the Japanese superannuation fund a bank bill. And the bank bill is sort of an IOU. It's establishing the conditions of the loan and also represents an obligation of the ANZ Bank to repay that loan after 90 days. So that's what a bank bill is. And the interest rate, or the annualized interest rate on that bank bill, might be 5%, just like we sort of dealt with here. Okay, so the annualized interest rate might be 5%, but over 90 days, the ANZ might be paying the Japanese superannuation fund, say 1.1%. Compounded gives you roughly a 5% return. So if banks enter these short-term debt markets to borrow money, they will issue bank bills. If the government, the federal government or the state government, wish to enter these markets and borrow money, they will issue treasury notes. And if Australian companies enter these short-term debt markets and borrow money, they'll issue commercial paper. So these are just the names of the financial instruments used to facilitate the borrowing and lending process in these short-term debt markets. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. In terms of these short-term debt markets, the lenders, remember, they can be Australian institutions, organisations, companies, or foreign institutions, organisations, companies. They can be companies, banks, governments, central banks, etc. So let's just think about it. If the Australian government wants to borrow money for 180 days, they would issue a treasury note to borrow that money. Who could the lender be? Well, it could be anyone wanting to lend money to the Australian government at that time and earn the going market interest rate. So it could be an Australian bank, an Australian superannuation fund. It could even be the state government borrowing or lending money to the federal government. It could be the central bank of Australia, the Reserve Bank. It could be central banks overseas. Could be foreign banks, foreign governments, foreign and domestic superannuation funds. There's just an endless number of potential lenders in these markets all around the world. It could be the lenders in this market could be insurance funds, generally insurance companies. Generally, insurance companies are paid premiums each year, and they invest those premiums and use the premiums and the returns on the premiums to pay out insurance claims. But that's how insurance companies operate. You might pay insurance of $1,000 a year to insure your car. What happens to that money? Well, the insurance company will take that $1,000 and invest it and use it, and the returns on that money, use the principal and the returns to pay out any insurance claims. So at any point in time, you may have insurance companies entering this market and lending money to the Australian government by buying a treasury note. So if you are a lender of money and you want to lend it to the Australian government, you will buy their treasury note. Buying a treasury note is the same as lending the Australian government money. And if the Australian government wants to borrow money, they will either issue or supply, same thing, a treasury note. Okay, they'll issue, sell a treasury note or supply a treasury note, just different words for the same sort of thing. Okay, so lenders will buy or demand a treasury note. And in that transaction, they're actually supplying loanable funds. Think about that. And a lender will issue or sell a treasury note or supply a treasury note when they want to borrow money. If Woodside wants to borrow money for 1 year, they will issue commercial paper. Very simple, very similar to a treasury note or a bank bill. It's just got a different name because the issuer is a different type of organization. Okay, so what we've got here is a timeline separating out short-term debt and long-term debt markets. These are all just markets for money. It's no more complicated than that. You've got big organizations borrowing and lending money in each of these markets. And we've just got to get used to the different terminology that is used in these markets. Bond markets, money markets, these, treasury notes, bank bills, commercial paper, short-term debt, long-term debt. Once you wrap your head around the different terminology, then this all becomes very, very simple. But it's impossible for me to explain how monetary policy in Australia, in the US, in Hong Kong, Singapore actually works without understanding these markets. And it's impossible for me to explain to you in detail how quantitative easing, which is kind of the buzz phrase recently in Australian macroeconomics, how that works without understanding these long-term debt markets in topic 4. Okay, so very soon we will see time series plots of 30, 90, 180-day interest rates, as well as the one-day interest rate. We'll see all of that. And just by seeing the data and talking about this a little bit more, and of course doing the suggested or required and optional reading, this will slowly all fall into place. What we have to do next is look at discount securities and what they actually look like and how they work. And discount securities are these things: treasury notes, bank bills, commercial paper. So what I'm going to do in the next video is explain to you exactly what a treasury note looks like and how it is sold into the marketplace, and how it plays its role as a facilitator of borrowing and lending of loanable funds in all of these different markets. One final point. It's not, I don't want you sort of going away thinking that there's a 30-day market, a 90-day market, 180-day market, and nothing else. Same with these longer-term debt markets. What I've got here is just some representative, slightly more common durations of lending. So if you've got a borrower and a lender, and they want to borrow and lend money for 193 days, right at that point, then they will establish, in a sense, they'll kind of establish a market for 193-day money. So you can have money being borrowed and loaned right across this spectrum at all sorts of very odd durations. But just to keep it simple, we're going to look at sort of the more common durations of 30, 90, 180, then 3, 5, 7, 10 years. Okay, so I'll leave it there and we'll move on to what discount securities are in the next video.